top and I don't see it. Oh, there it is. It's now recording. At least I know it's recording. And Richard's watching this. I recorded this last year, but I figured I should start over and not reuse things always. So I want to tell you about ecosystems. Like I said, this is my second time recording this. I got frustrated because I only did a audio recording. So I want to tell you a little bit about ecosystems, and what we're going to try and do is define ecosystems two ways, looking at biodiversity and looking at productivity. There are actually many ways that we can end up defining productivity, but we only have so many options. So let's just go with these two. So first thing is, it helps if we remember that the biotic and the abiotic play off of each other, meaning the biotic factors in an ecosystem turn out to manipulate their environment. They're going to use up nutrients, they're going to take up water, they're going to take up space, they're going to change the landscape, they'll block out sunlight, whatever they're going to do. And as a result, by changing the environment, what you're going to end up doing is forcing individuals to need to fit into that environment. And if you can't fit in, we're going to get rid of you. That process, of course, is natural selection. And natural selection is going to warp what is allowed inside of the area or what is not allowed, which will further warp the organisms, which will then be warping the environment, which will then warp the organisms as they warp the environment, and just kind of keeps on cycling around. So the biotic and the abiotic play off of each other quite a bit. But when we talk about an ecosystem, we need to look at both, and it's how that interaction that turns out to be going on, because everything is an interchange, an interplay between all sorts of things. So when I look at an ecosystem, this definition of the biotic and the abiotic, we have many different ways that we can look at it, meaning how far I wish to zoom in or zoom out. At its easiest, we could study ecosystems on an organism. So we can look at ecosystem in an organism, so how that organism is interacting with its environment. Or we could look at a population of them, a whole bunch of the same organisms interacting with their environment, or groups of these organisms interacting with their environment, or the entire type of pattern that we notice around the world, a biome, which would be similar types of environments and the organisms within them. But any view that we turn out to use, it's still dealing with an ecosystem. It's a mixture of the living and the non-living. And there's several sets of interactions that we can talk about. The last lecture or two lectures ago dealt with interactions. This one here, I just want to look at what can we talk about with that ecosystem idea in general. And that's actually not too bad. So the first thing that we can do is we could judge off of biodiversity. Biodiversity is how many different types of organisms live in that area and how many of each of those types of organisms live in an area, meaning how many species are there and how many of each of those species. And we could sit there and we can describe it. So if we remember from, what was it, 2 lectures ago? So on Tuesday when we dealt with interactions, you had that disturbance hypothesis, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So if you're always disturbing an ecosystem, you don't have a high biodiversity because there's only so many things that can start over. But if we never disturb an ecosystem, we also don't have high biodiversity because there's only so many things that can be there, because the mature stuff has kind of crowded everything else out. When you deal with anything in between, so the intermediate, you get high biodiversity because that's where you get plenty of options. When we look at biodiversity mathematically, we have an equation that we can play with. This is one of many equations that exist. This is one's called the Shannon Index. Any particular reason to know it? No, not in particular. And depending on who you talk to, meaning which ecologist you speak with, you get a different index that you would use. Just for the sake of defining these terms, so H prime is how we define the index. I equals 1 to R tells me how many species I'm dealing with. This funky E thing, if you don't know, is sigma. Sigma means add everything up after it. So this term here, PILNPI, you're going to add up all of these for every single I until you're done. Meaning if you had 10 different species, PI will go from P1 through P10, we cycle through this 10 times, meaning I'm going to get this product of multiplying these two things, and I'm going to add up all 10 of them. That's what's going to get me my index. PI stands for the proportion, meaning if you had 3 species, A, B, and C, A had 10, B had 15, and C had 15. So for species A, it'd be 10 of the 40, and 10 of the 40 is 25%. So the proportion of species A would be 0.25. And I'd multiply that by the natural log of that proportion. So natural log of 0.25 is going to get me some type of negative number. So I multiply these two, I'm going to get some negative number in there. I add all of those negative numbers up. I'm going to take the negative of it. Hooray, I have my index. For this one here, especially any of them that deal with proportions, and whenever you have any of them that deal with proportions and natural logs, the natural log of a fraction, meaning natural log of anything smaller than 1 but greater than 0, because natural log of 0 is undefined. But if we have the natural log of a fraction somewhere between the 0 and a 1, you get a negative number. And that's because of just the definition of a natural log. And if you want to know more about what a natural log is because you haven't learned that in math, go talk to your math teacher. I'm sure they'll roll their eyes and then tell you all sorts of math that you want to know. Or that you might not want to know, but they'll tell you why that turns out to be the case. So if I were to have one organism or one type of organism in a population or inside of an ecosystem, the proportion of that organism is a 1. So PI would be 1. Natural log of 1, you in the audience, you should immediately pop out and say, oh, natural log of 1 is 0, which I'd say, good job. So if I have a population or an ecosystem with only one type of organism in this entire sum here becomes 0, which means anything else is going to be bigger than 0. So the closer I make this particular index to a 0, the less diverse it is. The further away I get from a 0, the more diverse that particular ecosystem turns out to be. When I look at biodiversity over time, it fluctuates, meaning if I look at this graph going from current time to 550 million years ago, hooray for the Cambrian explosion, if I go after all of this time, like we can do by looking at fossils is we can look at number of proposed genera, so it goes genus, species, that turn out to exist, and this is in thousands of genera. And what we notice is over time, meaning from 550 million years ago to now, it goes up and then it'll go down. It'll go up, then it'll go down. Then up, down, 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 up. Each of those down periods is what we call a mass extinction event, meaning where lots of genera are disappearing, meaning tens or hundreds, if not thousands, of genera start to disappear on us. One of the bigger ones was this one right here. So the yellow ones tell you they're big ones because that's what it flat out says. This one here, the Permian, took out 90 some odd % of all the genera in existence at the time. So this is, by percentage, one of the worst that has ever existed. It looks like, ooh, we have a lot of diversity now, but we also have a lot of organisms where there's one species in the genera, so it kind of warps how these data turn out to look. When we look at this, biodiversity changes. So obviously the more genera you have, the more diversity could possibly exist. But one of the concerns is, if we look, it goes up, and then there's going to be a drop. We're at a period of up, so the question is, when are we going to have our next drop? And depending on which scientists you talk to, some are claiming we're already in the next die-off. And now the question is it humans? Is it natural? Is it a combination of the two? It was happening and we're just making it worse? That's a different conversation. The other way I can look at an ecosystem, I can look about how much energy it's producing. And we call that production or productivity. There's a difference between the words production and productivity. A production is how much you turn out to make, meaning you could have a production of 10 paper clips. You could have a production of 3 cars. You could have a production of 5 plays. You could have a production of 50 essays. You could have a production of 700 questions. All a production turns out to be is an amount. So what you could look at is what we call gross production and net production. Let's ignore the primary part for now. Gross production would be how much did you make in total. So this one here says rate, that's actually wrong. But it's gross production. How much in total did you turn out to make? Net production is how much of your production, how much that you made, did you get to keep? Because it turns out all living things need to respire. They need to go through some type of process of some form of respiration, whether it's just glycolysis or glycolysis and Krebs cycle or some other thing. Somehow we're dealing with a utilization of energy and of stuff that's produced. So the difference between these two is respiration, or the burning of excess energy during times when you can't make energy. Gross production is always going to be a bigger number than net production, because net production is the gross, but you get rid of what you must get rid of, and that is respiration loss, or following the second law of thermodynamics, because we have to follow the second law of thermodynamics no matter what. And this is stuff that we have to get rid of. So, gross primary production is the max. You get rid of what you need to get rid of because of the second law of thermodynamics, and you're left with the net. The net production is what is available to be passed on. So if we're dealing with a producer, producers are the first in the chain. They're the first in line. They are the first trophic level. So they make primary production because they are the primary trophic level, or the first trophic level. So their net production, their net primary production, is everything that they have stuck inside of them being producers, that a consumer can then come along and take if they can figure out a way to consume it. The other term that we could use is productivity. Productivity gives us a rate. So a rate meaning how much you produced per time. So you made 5 cars. Okay, who cares if you made 5 cars? I told you I made 5 cars in a day. Oh, well, holy crap, that's actually a lot better. I graded 70 essays. Okay, I don't know if that's good or bad. I graded 70 essays over the course of 10 years. Oh, well, I guess I don't grade that many essays. I grade 70 essays over the course of an afternoon. Oh, well, that's totally different. I'm changing how quickly something is occurring. Productivity is how quickly things happen. So you can do that in terms of days, or you can do it in terms of hours, or months, or whatever you wish to use for productivity. As long as you remain the same, we can compare these two terms. Again, what you do is the producers are going to have so much productivity. They're going to have so much overall net production, and that is capable of being passed on to the second trophic level, or the third trophic level, or the fourth trophic level. And those organisms, those consumers, are going to eat the food. They're going to respire. They're going to give off waste, and they get to keep some of the nutrients that they consume. That keeping of the nutrients they consume is a secondary net productivity, or secondary productivity, because that's what they get to hold on to, because they're going to lose part of this in the process of staying alive. The reason why they're going to lose it is because of the second law of thermodynamics. So if I look at productivity, one of the easiest ways we can do this is by looking at the ability to produce oxygen. One of the easiest ways that we can look at producing oxygen is through how much chlorophyll do you happen to have. Because the more chlorophyll you have, the more you're going to be able to go through photosynthesis, which means you should have higher rates of primary production. So higher rate of primary production meaning higher primary productivity. If I look at this map, the darker the green is on land, the higher the productivity. The whiter or the yellower it is, or the browner it gets, the less there is. In the oceans, the closer you get to red, the higher the productivity. The bluer you get, or the purpler you get, the lower the productivity. What you turn out to look at is on land, there's massive amounts of production, but then we also have big splotches where there's not. And that has to do with the location, how the winds turn out to blow. So that, in part, is a latitude and a longitude issue. If I look at the oceans, however, most of the oceans are blue. Not talking about color, but in terms of how much chlorophyll there is. Why is that worth pointing out? Because if we don't have much chlorophyll, we're not going to have a lot of primary productivity. If we don't have a lot of primary productivity, there's not going to be much energy available. Net result, we call these areas where there's not a lot of primary productivity, whether it's land or ocean, a desert. Most of the Earth, aquatic-wise, is a desert, and it's one of the few things that people don't tend to think of. The Earth is primarily a desert, and we have these weird freak patch areas where we actually have a lot of productivity occurring. So, again, with this productivity thing, depending on how much productivity you have, so how much primary productivity you have, that will influence how much energy you have to move on to secondary consumers or tertiary consumers or quaternary consumers, how far you can spread this energy out, because again, we have that 10% rule going on. It's 10% because 90% plus is being lost in the form of heat, because thank you, second law of thermodynamics. The more producers we have, or the more productivity we can get out of these producers, the larger set of consumers we can have. The more consumers we can maintain in an area, along with their decomposers, will increase biodiversity. So looking at an ecosystem in terms of productivity tells us about biodiversity. And looking at an area and its biodiversity, we can infer some information about its productivity. Areas that are really diverse are really productive. Areas that aren't that diverse aren't that productive, typically speaking. So the two ways of looking at an ecosystem, through biodiversity or through productivity, they're kind of the same thing. It's just a matter of how you wish to view it. One of the issues, because it has to be said, is ecosystems are fragile. It's a balance of how that energy gets transferred, but it's also a balance of productivity. And it's, are you influencing or are you changing what is in there? So here's an example that I can give you. It's been raining quite a bit. So you're watching this Friday, February 10th, yay my birthday. One of the things that's supposed to happen today is it's supposed to be raining. Obviously, I'm not predicting the future. That's what the forecasts say. So this video is right or wrong. So it was either raining today or it wasn't. When it rains, what you get is agricultural runoff, meaning all the fertilizers that are put into the ground, assuming that they're putting in excess fertilizer, that's going to be washed off, be put into a storm drain. That storm drain is going to be shot into the Santa Ana riverbed, and it's going to be shot straight out to the Pacific Ocean. Hooray. So you have all that water dumping into the Pacific Ocean. In that water, you happen to have nutrients. You get fertilizer, in particular nitrogens, phosphoruses, and potassiums, so NPK. They're the big three that you care about with fertilizer, although micronutrients are a big deal too. So we get all this fertilizer dumping in. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are not normally found in aquatic environments, so they help limit what goes on. The plants that are capable of growing very quickly in the presence of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are going to be the ones that are going to reap the benefit of us accidentally adding nutrition to the aquatic environment, artificially eutrophing the environment, because eutrophication, for those of you who took apes, because you're probably giggling right now, is when you artificially add food to an environment. It's not supposed to happen. Oops, it happened anyway. So we had eutrophication occur, and now what we're going to get are these plants, these tiny photosynthetic plants, we'll call them algae, and they're going to immediately start to reproduce in massive numbers. We'll call that an algal bloom. So what you'll get are these massive algal blooms inside of the ocean. A lot of them turn out to release toxic materials, so they'll start poisoning whatever's inside of the water. What they're also going to turn out to do is, as soon as the light goes down, they're going to start respiring, and they're going to start sucking oxygen out of the water, and they're just going to start sucking nutrients out of the water. Well, what's that going to do? It's going to start killing fish, and they're going to start releasing wastes, which will actually make it so you actually can't go into the ocean, which is a bad deal. So by us farming to keep us around, it rains, we accidentally disrupt an ecosystem because we're going to start throwing things out of whack. We're going to start having organisms blooming that shouldn't be blooming, and the result of organisms blooming that shouldn't be blooming is we're going to start killing off the organism that should be in that community in the first place. Ecosystems are fragile. Humans, it makes sense for us to want to focus just on us. It completely and totally makes sense. But one of the things that we need to keep in mind is we're not the only things out here. And what we do does have consequences to other living things. With that, what you're going to want to do for homework is you're going to want to add questions to these notes. You're obviously going to be adding a summary for the energy notes that you took yesterday. What you're going to want to do right now, because hopefully there should be enough time, is you have some plants that you need to be measuring. So it's only going to be the plants that you're testing for after 1 week. Obviously, we're going to run for another week. Please, please, please don't make a mess. If you do make a mess, clean up that mess. Also, there are going to be baggies left in the front. You're going to need to remove all of the leaves from your plant. You're going to want to place all of those leaves. Don't tear them up or anything like that. Just remove all of the leaves. If you have flowers, take the flowers too. Put those into a bag. Seal the bag so that we don't have any evaporative loss from the bag. And then put your name on the bag so that next week on Tuesday we can go and we can figure out the masses of things, because it helps if we get all that. If you wait till Tuesday, all of your numbers turn out to not matter. Obviously, once you mass your plant, you've removed the leaves, you're not using this plant through next week, so you're going to need to chuck it into the trash. The sinks are not trash. Please don't leave stuff in the sinks.